Hello and welcome to today's webinar, Optimizing Global Food Aid Operations with Dr. Ozlem Ergun of Northeastern University. Thanks so much for joining us for the second webinar in this year's Gurobi Days Digital Academic Webinar Series, which is themed around optimization for good. My name is Lindsay Montanari and I lead the academic program and corporate social responsibility efforts for Gurobi. This year's Gurobi Days Digital Academic Webinar Series is a particularly special one as it aligns with the launch of Gurobi Gives Back, which is a new initiative that we debuted earlier this year. As you may have heard during our panel discussion on Monday, this new program provides free, unrestricted licenses to qualifying nonprofit organizations working towards at least one of the UN Sustainable Development Goals. To date, we've seen 13 organizations who have partnered with Gurobi Gives Back, including our premier partners Analytics for a Better World and ESUPs, who are leveraging optimization to drive impactful change across the world. For more information about this initiative, attendees can explore the website at gurobi.com and go to the Company tab. We're thrilled to see how optimization is being used to make a difference in the world. So before we get started, I wanted to share just a quick couple of notes to ensure you have the best experience during today's webinar. First, for optimal viewing, please take a moment to click on the gear icon at the bottom right of the presentation and be sure to select 1080p. Dr. Ergun will walk us through some detailed models and figures, so higher resolution is going to ensure the best viewing experience. Second, we encourage you to ask questions throughout the webinar using the Ask a Question tab below the presentation. We'll address as many as we can during the final 5 to 10 minutes or so of the session. Along with Dr. Ergun, we're fortunate to have Dr. Dan Steffi from our technical team here today, and he's also ready to assist with any questions at the end. Finally, we value your feedback. At the end of today's session, please take a moment to rate the talk and share any comments. Your input helps us tailor future webinars to topics that matter most to you. So now I'm delighted to introduce Dr. Ozlem Ergun. Dr. Ergun is a College of Engineering Distinguished Professor at Northeastern University. Her research focuses on the design and management of large-scale and decentralized networks, applying her work to critical systems such as transportation, pharmaceuticals, and healthcare. She's collaborated extensively with organizations responding to emergencies and humanitarian crises. Those organizations include USAID, UN World Food Program, UNHCR, and FEMA, among many others. Notably, she's contributed to Massachusetts' COVID-19 response by helping match qualified medical professionals to long-term care facilities. Before joining Northeastern, Dr. Ergun was the Coca-Cola Associate Professor at Georgia Tech, where she co-founded and co-directed the Health and Humanitarian Systems Research Center. She holds a BS in Operations Research and Industrial Engineering from Cornell and a PhD in Operations Research from MIT. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Ozlem Ergun. Over to you to introduce your important research and your focus on optimization for good.
Hello. Today I will be talking about using mathematical optimization for helping with making global food aid operations more efficient and effective. This is work that I have been conducting for over a decade and a half with many colleagues and students at multiple institutions and with multiple agencies. The challenges that are faced in the global food aid industry or the sector today are both coming from the demand and the supply sides. So on the demand side, the magnitude of the crisis has been increasing. In fact, it went from acute food insecurity went from 135 million in 2019 to over almost 350 million in 2023. On the other hand, on the supply side of food aid, the resources has been limited and have been affected from multiple factors, from climate change, including climate change, political conflicts, and global health crisis that strain the global food systems. So there has been a significant pressure on humanitarian organizations, both, as I said, both on the supply and the demand sides, and that basically caused a widening gap on the mismatch between supply and demand, and which really led to organizations or leading the organizations to really think about how can they be cost effective and how can they actually be cost effective and have on-time delivery in an environment where most of the large-scale humanitarian organizations are actually responding to multiple types of crises throughout a year. And these crises include ongoing but significant food insecurity situations and really sudden onset and not really forecastable events that are also happening in more frequently and in increased frequency and also at larger magnitudes, mostly due to the climate crisis and conflict, armed conflict around the world. So there is always more room and really a need for being more cost effective, meaning that with the given amount of monetary and other resources, how can we actually increase the number of beneficiaries that we serve? How can we increase the more needy, the number of or the proportion of more needy beneficiaries that we serve? So if you look at the humanitarian supply chains, it's similar to most supply chains. However, there are some key differences. So, for example, in humanitarian supply chains, usually the supply chain operation starts with a given donation, and then after a donation, actually things start to move and get mobilized, including materials, people, and so on and so forth. This is, if you think about it, somewhat inefficient because as in most supply chains, the planning function or the mobilization function happens after the need actually arises, which generally means that in so many cases that by the time we start mobilizing materials and people in the humanitarian supply chains, we're already late to respond to an existing need. So there is a need for using all the tools that we have to bring the right commodities with the right volume to the right place at the right time in a cost-effective way, but by identifying the right transfer modality ratios and prepositioning options for all operations. So there are quite a few things that we need to think about. And I will be talking about at least a few of these issues through the lens that I have gained by working with two of the largest food aid humanitarian organizations in the world. First, I will very briefly talk about some of the work that I have done with the United Nations World Food Programme. And then I will move on to somewhat more recent work that I have been doing with USAID and USAID's Food for Peace programs. So as I said, there's a gap in supply and demand for the physical goods. There exists some research gaps as well. And some of this, like to summarize, there is a need for building data-driven models that actually do account for real-world constraints, real-world issues, and use the data that comes from the real world to actually build recommendations using these models. To do that, we have to build real-world scenarios that reflect the real world, including all of its risks and risk profiles. At the same time, there is also a need to really think about an integrated humanitarian logistics operations, looking at multiple commodities, multiple periods, multi-echelon considerations, as well as thinking about how can an organization actually respond to different demand with different characteristics. As I mentioned earlier, kind of sudden onset demand versus ongoing demand that kind of like happens all the time, which is somewhat forecastable. So I will briefly mention my work in with the World Food Program, WFP in short. It's WFP basically procures from all around the world, and it serves more than 80 countries around the world. The thing that I think should be interesting for us is the fact that if you look at WFP's cost, the logistics operations is actually, if we look at WFP supply chain cost, the logistics operations is actually the highest proportion of the supply chain operations, meaning that anything that we can do to improve the distribution system's efficiency and effectiveness, we will actually be having a big impact on the bottom line of WFP operations. So my work with WFP has started about 15 years ago. The first thing that we did was actually a business case study for trying to demonstrate the potential impact of WFP buying or advanced purchasing and buying early and pre-positioning these materials to respond to events around the world. This was in response to some of the real challenges that WFP faces every day, including variability and timing of not the events that they have to respond to, not only to those, but also the variability and timing of donations, the rigidity in the supply chains, and also the variable prices and the variable availability of commodities and the transport capacity. So after this study, and to do this study, we did use a mathematical programming framework. What we have recommended at the time to WFP was that by about using $5 million of its own funds to do advanced purchasing and pre-positioning, they could actually increase the number of beneficiaries that they have served, that they can serve by about 5 million people. Furthermore, we talked about a revolving working capital financing for implementing these kind of advanced purchasing options. And basically what we have shown them was that if they used about $60 million of working capital financing, they could improve service levels by almost 5%. So this study, of course, with many other initiatives that supported this idea in WFP, became one of the key corner points of building a case for trying advanced purchasing and pre-positioning. And in fact, after several pilot studies, now this is advanced purchasing and pre-positioning is a common operational and tactical strategy within WFP. More recently, still about a decade ago, we looked at WFP's supply chain, and we really were considering four different organizations within WFP, including their programming division, both the groups that are looking into how to design the food basket, and also the groups who are looking at choosing the modality of the aid, meaning that should we actually bring in the goods and deliver the goods, or shall we bring in more monetary aid because the goods actually exist in the marketplace locally. We have also looked at the sourcing department, the procurement department that does sourcing when there is the decision of the modalities to actually bring in the goods. So the question becomes, how do we source this globally? And now once the sourcing decisions are completed, the logistics group or the division looks at routing these sourced material or procured materials that were coming from global sources into the location where there is the need. In the early days, about a decade ago, WFP's organization worked in a very siloed way, and all of these decisions were made sequentially and without any interaction between the different groups. So you can imagine the inefficiencies that existed. So our goal was to bring these parties' decision-making capabilities together and make one optimal and enable this and build a decision support tool that will enable an optimal solution that actually considered all of these decisions at the same time. So to do this, we initially build a kind of a demonstration supply chain optimization tool based on a multi-commodity, multi-period network flow problem model, and representing all the food basket choices, all sources, global and local, and the modalities, and then all the routing options, including ocean shipping, inland transportation, and so on and so forth. And these models, we really worked with the WFP supply chain group, and these models evolved throughout years. And actually, if you look at the road to success in the supply chain optimization tool, we really spent, and when I say we, it's mostly WFP, I really spent about 4 to 5 years just building the necessary data infrastructure and human resources with optimization background. So they brought in people with our type of backgrounds. And also the initial demonstration models really helped them to identify what kind of data was really needed to be centrally available to make these kind of decision aid tools work. There was also a significant change management that was required. And in fact, many different groups, including logistics and procurement, are now connected under the supply chain, heading of the supply chain division, which enabled really this joint decision-making framework. At the end, we now have Optimus, which is an open source, web-based, almost 100% automated tool that can not be only that is run at the headquarters, but also is capable of being run at country offices with personnel with only supply chain backgrounds and not necessarily any expertise in optimization itself. And one of the things that I'm really proud of, these are some quotes that I got from one of the supply chain annual reports that the WFP had a couple of years ago. And some of the things that we see is that the solution uses mathematical algorithms to assess all available options and propose optimized supply chain setups. And then there are like mentions to different operations and how much was actually saved, or in terms of by using this optimization tool, such as like here's an Iraqi operations, mention to Ethiopian operations, and then there's also some mention to advanced positioning, which is kind of a kickback to our earliest work with WFP, and so on and so forth. So WFP has been at this point is really in the front. Is really in the cutting edge of using mathematical optimization for many different aspects of their operations and also tactical and strategic planning. So next, I'd like to talk about our more recent work at the United States Agency for International Development. And myself and my students were part of a 5-year study that worked with the Bureau for Humanitarian Assistance, BHA for short. This bureau got established during the time we were working with WFP. Initially, we had started working with Food for Peace program, which then became the Bureau for Humanitarian Assistance after they joined with OFDA, which is the Office of Foreign Disaster, which used to be the Office of Foreign Disaster Assistance. So USAID or BHA actually responds to about 75 to 80 crises annually around the world with at least 65, 70 countries every year. And the nature of the crisis that they respond to is really different, kind of very similar to WFP. It can be a crisis due to some political conflict or armed conflict versus kind of natural disasters or droughts and so forth. So the study that we were part of was led by the Tufts University, and it was called the Food Aid Quality Review. It was led by a nutritional specialist, and we were the group who actually came in and looked at how can we increase efficiency and effectiveness of the outcomes by looking at supply chain operations. So today I will be talking about a sliver of the work that we did with WFP, with the USAID, USAID's BHA. And I would say that we can really divide the work that we have done into two groups. First, we worked with data initially, and we did a data study that was long-term and looked at many years of data, and we came up with some descriptive data analysis. I would say this was really helpful to kind of go back and explain to USAID what their operations were doing, what was going right, and what were some opportunities for improvement. So out of this, we came up with a couple of ideas, such as looking at, for example, the seasonality of prices and availability, both for commodities and on transportation. And also, so looking at those and a couple of other things, we basically brought in the idea of potential prepositioning and kind of increasing prepositioning options and programs around the globe. We've also looked at tracking and visibility, and also tracking and visibility of demand information, and how far in advance actually this demand information could become available for USAID for them to actually start mobilizing their procurement process. So as I said, the descriptive data analysis actually kind of pointed to a couple of improvement areas, and then we took those ideas and we built data-driven basically optimization models to see if these ideas can be implemented effectively within the USAID operations, and if they were to be implemented, then what would be the impact of these ideas on the supply chain operations in terms of both number of beneficiaries served, but also or the cost of serving beneficiaries, but not only that, but also looking at what were the on-time delivery rates and how were these getting changed for different locations around the globe. So I will be talking a little bit about two different studies. So the first study that we did was actually focusing on Ethiopian operations, and looking at the end-to-end supply chains to see if some of these ideas that we were bringing in will make a big difference. So the reason that we chose Ethiopia is because it's the largest. It has been the largest receiving country from USAID for a long time. And we had a lot of data for Ethiopia. And in fact, we also knew and were able to get data from implementing partners on ground in Ethiopia very effectively as well. So it was a perfect candidate for doing an end-to-end study. So our objective, as I said, was really looking into cost efficiency, but also not only that, but also on-time delivery. We use data from both USAID and USDA, as well as the in-country partners, including WFP and CRS. And then what we did was we actually built these time-expanded minimum cost network flow problems or models, and then we used the rolling horizon framework to kind of mimic the USAID operations, which kind of revealed information that came over time to test the effectiveness of different prepositioning and advanced demand information strategies. So just to get a little bit more in depth into the USAID's network or food aid network, you can just look at this picture. And basically everything is all the commodities are procured from the US suppliers, and from there on, the commodities are either sent to a loading port in US to be shipped across the globe, or they might also go into a prepositioning warehouse that's in the US. Later on, after the commodities leave the US ports, they will go to an international port, a destination. And at the international port, again, they can either go into extended delivery points, such as regional warehouses, or they can go into international prepositioning warehouses to be pulled out when needed in the future. And then from the extended delivery points, the commodities use inland transportation for the most part to go into final delivery points where they are actually distributed to the beneficiaries. So one thing that's interesting and we should note is that all the operations that are in this orange box are handled by in-country partners. So USAID usually does not do the distribution of operations after the commodities are after the commodities actually get into a country or a region. However, as we know, most of the decisions that we make on up the supply chain will have significant impacts on down the supply chain. So because we were looking at these larger scale issues on should we do prepositioning, should we try to get more advanced demand information, what USAID wanted to do was to actually consider the entire end-to-end supply chain, including the decisions and the operations of in-country partners, so that we can properly account for the effectiveness of these ideas that we had. So as I said, because we started looking at end-to-end, and we really wanted to come up with a detailed in-country distribution network picture, we worked with mostly WFP, and we really even focused, even focused more. So we ended up really considering the Somali region of Ethiopia as our kind of case study base. And here there were a couple of ports, but the most important port was Djibouti. And then there was a potential of an international warehouse at the port. And then there were the extended delivery points, and then about 50 final delivery points that we considered in our study. In terms of the commodities, we looked at mostly packaged commodity deliveries, and in some studies, we only used yellow split peas as our one commodity that we were considering to make the case, because basically yellow split peas account for 60% of the distribution of food aid commodities for USAID in Ethiopia. And in some later studies, to do some robustness checks, we included some other commodities that were also high in volume, just to see if the insights that we got on one commodity actually apply to other commodities as well. So I'm not going to show you all the mathematical models, sets, and parameters, but we did have large-scale models with many different parameters, many different variables to really account for the fact that we were looking at a multi-period model. We decide and multi-period, multi-commodity global, well, not necessarily global, but a large-scale model. So our decision-making periods were about 2 weeks, and because just looking at the operations, it made sense to look at 2-week periods. And the demand information got updated at the beginning of each month. Again, these were all mimicking actual USAID operations. Our objective was to minimize cost, which included the supply chain cost plus the unsatisfied demand penalty over time. Our constraints, they were not things that were really different than what you would really expect. We had flow balance and capacity constraints. We had some inventory-related constraints to making sure that we don't also, whenever we use prepositioning inventory, we also brought it back by the end of the period or the decision horizon. We also had some additional operational and policy-related constraints, such as the US flag rule, which asked USAID to do its ocean ship, a certain percentage of its ocean shipping by only US carriers. And we used the rolling horizon algorithm because mostly it actually helped us to mimic the USAID operations more properly as information got, like, such as demand information got revealed over time. And so and USAID makes sequential decisions at this point. So what we did is we actually iteratively solved smaller chunks of the problem as we gathered more data that we mimic coming in over time. So for advanced demand information, we basically said that our sub-horizon planning, so every time we solve a chunk of the rolling horizon problem, we basically equate that length of that chunk as with the duration of the advanced demand information that we had. And then we considered different prepositioning strategies that I'll call CPS. And basically what we did is we decided on preposition initial inventory levels as proportional amounts with observed average demand. And then we made sure, as I said before, that commodities got repositioned by at least to the amounts that they were inventory amounts that we had in the beginning of the periods at certain intervals. So what we did is we did scenario analysis to basically try out many different operational strategies, both on the advanced demand information and the commodity prepositioning. And we also wanted to see how those two different ideas interacted with in terms of the actual outcomes that we saw on the supply chains. So we did 3 different scenarios. One was we took all the historical data we had and we used its averages to create a scenario. So this really represented, so the insights that we got out of this really represented what we saw if we looked at like kind of an averaged out year. On the other hand, we wanted to do some robustness checks because no year is an average year. So we wanted to understand how some of the uncertainties and the variability within a year actually might impact the insights that we were gathering. So what we did was we actually looked at these 5-year data. We looked at scenarios for 5 years of actual real data in terms of demand and cost and capacities on transportation and procurement side. And we ran these different strategies over this data, both for single commodity and multi-commodity settings. And so basically we ended up with these 3 scenarios. Scenario 1 is the averaged out demand, and we ran it for 12 months. Scenario 2 is the 5-year of historical data, and we only ran it with 1 commodity. And then scenario 3 is again the 5-year worth of real data, but with multi-commodity, with more than 1 commodity. And then on the advanced demand information, we tried to see what will happen if we have 3 months, 4 months, or 6 months of advanced demand information. And then we looked at the cases where we have no prepositioning strategy, and then kind of mid and high levels of prepositioning strategy, both at international warehouses and extended delivery points. So in our analysis, we looked at 3 performance metrics. One was just cost per unit delivered. And then the other 2 was looking at what was the average demand fulfillment ratio, which is at the end of our entire planning horizon, how much of the actual demand were we actually able to deliver? Because sometimes even by the end of a 5-year period, we were not able to deliver all the demand. We also looked at the on-time delivery ratio, meaning that we looked at if we were able to help what proportion of the demand that actually arrived on time as at the time it was demanded. So we came up with a couple of insights. So if you look at the graphs at the bottom, the leftmost graph looks at the total estimated cost. Middle is average demand fulfillment ratio, and then the right-hand side of the graph looks at on-time ratio, on-time demand fulfillment ratio. And then what we see is that the x-axis is advanced demand information strategies. So we have a 3-month, 4-month, and 6-month scenarios. And then the colored lines, the lines that are colored gives us which prepositioning strategy that we were applying on top of this ADI. So the blue line is no prepositioning, orange is medium level prepositioning, and green is high levels of prepositioning. So what we see in general is as we increase the advanced demand information duration, so if we can get, for example, 6 months of, if we can get demand information 6 months in advance, we actually do the best, no matter in terms of cost. For all prepositioning, for the 2 prepositioning strategies of either if we don't preposition or if we do a mid-level prepositioning. However, if we actually can get 6 months of information, it looked like that we really didn't need high levels of prepositioning. And this was an interesting outcome that we were not necessarily expecting. In terms of the average demand fulfillment ratios, what we saw was after if we can get 4 months of advanced demand information, then we could actually fulfill almost all our ratios under any of the prepositioning strategies. And then similarly, after if we had about 4 months of advanced demand information, we could basically reach almost 99 to 100% of on-time demand, demand delivery ratios under any of the prepositioning strategies. So, and then we also looked at kind of equity, which meaning that we looked at how much, so the bottom graph shows over different planning periods, what is the on-time delivery ratio. So what we saw is that as we increased the prepositioning levels and prepositioning levels, we actually were able to satisfy demand over on-time demand over all periods. Very similarly, we also saw that as we increase ADI and advanced demand information, we were actually also better in terms of satisfying demand in more locations. So what we have concluded from that is that we can actually be more kind of have more uniform operations in terms of on-time demand delivery, both over different periods of the planning horizon, but also over different locations. So we won't be really leaving any location back. And then I'm not going to get into this much, but what we saw, all the results I have just shown you was for the first scenario. But when we looked at scenarios 2 and 3, we basically saw that all the insights that we gathered actually held. And basically at the end, what we have recommended was that if USAID can get about 4 months of advanced demand information, then they can really implement kind of mid-level prepositioning strategies, and with those strategies, they would actually be able to have both cost effectiveness and on-time demand satisfaction. And then we also compared these results with some of the historical operational costs, and we were able to show that actually there was some cost improvements, or we would expect to get some cost improvements over the historical operations as well. So in the next couple of minutes, I will talk about a more recent study that we have been in, that is really ongoing, still working with the USAID's Global Food Aid Supply Chain. But this time, instead of looking at a focused end-to-end supply chain, we're looking at a four-echelon global network, and we are really considering. So let me first actually explain the network. We are looking at, again, procurement from the US suppliers, and then movement of the commodities into either US loading ports or warehouses, and from there, shipment to international ports and warehouses, and then finally moving the commodities into final delivery countries. As you can see, we're no longer looking at distribution networks within a country. And our goal is really trying to locate warehouses and decide on safety stock levels for responding to both ongoing demand and also sudden onset demand. And again, we would like to minimize the expected supply chain cost, including the fixed cost of opening the warehouses plus the operational cost, and also minimize the demand response time. So we use the same data sets as before, and this time our methodology has been a little bit different because we had different tasks. So we had same data, but our data was not really labeled into, oh, this is a sudden onset event, or here's an ongoing operation demand. So the first thing that we did was we actually used deep learning models for taking in the historical data and separating it into ongoing, or labeling it into ongoing and sudden onset demand. And then from there, generate different types of scenarios. And then the second part of our work, including modeling this stochastic problem and looking at basically different ways to solve this stochastic problem to generate some insights in terms of not only where should USAID open warehouses for prepositioning, and how much commodity inventory levels of different commodities that should be placed in these warehouses, but also to drive some insights in terms of what kind of factors in these real world reflecting scenarios drive certain decisions in warehouse opening and operations. So I think I have already mentioned these. Basically, as I said, we do see, if you look at the data, we do see some ongoing type of events and some sudden onset events, but they're not labeled. And then also responding to these kinds of different types of data events have different operational characteristics and restrictions, including, for example, for ongoing demand, which we assume to be forecastable, responding to it includes regular procurement, but as well as some proactive planning in terms of advanced purchasing and prepositioning, as I have been mentioning before. But also, but on the other hand, for sudden onset demand, which we consider to be rare events and non-forecastable, we had to make sure that there could be some proactive planning, but without really knowing anything in advance. But then also there could be some reactive procurement, meaning that as an event unfolds, there could also be some global procurement and mobilization of transportation resources. So we had to model these properly to make sure that we actually, I'll talk about the modeling in a second. But so what we did first was to really generate these scenarios that looked at both, that could generate a set of events that accounted for the right number and the frequency and the global distribution of these ongoing and sudden onset demands. So in our framework, we did data pre-processing, we did data separation to kind of do anomaly detection, where we called anomalies as the sudden onset events. Based on that separation, we used some generative modeling to actually come up with the scenarios that looked kind of right in terms of the characteristics of what we have seen historically at USAID, but also kind of generated a right set of the right risk profile around around the scenarios. And then we build an optimization model to solve these decision problems using over these scenarios that we have been generating. So one of the biggest challenges on the modeling part was really to kind of making sure that we could implement the constraints when we were looking at responding to sudden onset events, because in sudden onset events, we do not want to kind of reveal what would be happening in the future in the model. To do that, we actually did these limited path generations for reactive procurement, for proactive usage of safety stocks, and then reactive inventory replenishment to replenish whatever we have used in the safety stocks that we had in our warehouses. And then we built these two-stage stochastic programming framework, where in the first stage, we decided on the opening of the warehouses, which warehouses to be opened, and then the safety stock levels. And then in the second stage, we had basically different scenarios with stochastic realization that represent these stochastic realizations, and then and these usually ended up being multi-period models themselves, and then we try to minimize the total cost. So in terms of the constraints, we had the regular network flow type of constraints, and as I said, we now had this mixed model where we had arc variables that represent the operations for ongoing response, and then path variables that represented the operations for responding to sudden onset events. And then we had to build these safety stock policies in terms of making sure that whatever was in the safety stock got actually replenished every so often. And then we also added the other USAID policy constraints, such as the US flag rules, and then some budgetary constraints for actually opening up warehouses. So at the end, we ended up with two types of scenarios. One was the historical scenario, historical data, where we considered each year as one scenario. However, we labeled the data within 1 year as sudden onset versus ongoing event. And then we also did just basically using our learning models, we could generate many synthetic scenarios that represent for 12-month periods that we hoped represented kind of the variability and the characteristics of the USAID's challenges. So I'm going to, from now on, I will just show you a few initial results. So if we look at where to position warehouses when considering a risk profile based on historical scenarios and solving, basically given all our historical scenarios, putting these all into our stochastic programming approach, we got we got different types of results based on some of the cases we studied. However, looking at where we should position our warehouses, we basically most of the time got these 4 warehouses, 3 in Africa and 1 in Southeast Asia. And this study actually included the budgetary constraint that USAID has to deal with, that they have over the funds that they can spend on opening up warehouses. When we run the same scenarios with the stochastic optimization model, but relaxing the budgetary constraint, we saw that actually the more expensive warehouses in the US got opened. And in fact, not only that they got opened, but they actually helped to bring down overall cost, although the warehousing proportion of the budget was higher. So just to kind of get into these a little bit more, looking at the 3 cases that we studied. The first case, no proactive strategy for sudden onset demand, so no safety stocks prepositioned around the globe for sudden onset events, and only prepositioning used for ongoing demand. In case 2, we looked at safety stocks for sudden onset events as well. and then the safety stocks and preposition stocks used for both ongoing and sudden onset demand. And then in case 3, we looked at exactly what we did in case 2, but relaxing the budgetary constraint. What we have seen is actually quite significant, where we see that the demand fulfillment ratios go up to almost 100%. And then the response times for sudden onset events almost goes down to half of what it is when we start using proactive safety stock positioning for sudden onset events around the globe. And more important, and of course the cost goes up a little bit, and the other significant thing that we have insight that we have gathered was the fact that as we allowed using more of our budget for warehouse related costs, the total cost per unit delivered actually came down. So the second and the last part of my talk, I will talk a little bit about something that we did that is really ongoing work, which is now saying, instead of looking at stochastic optimization, scenario-based stochastic optimization models to decide on inventory warehouse locations and inventory levels, how about we generate many scenarios, because now we have the machinery to generate many different scenarios that are realistic enough, and then solve for the same decisions of warehouse location and inventory levels, but for each scenario separately. And then let's look at all the solutions that we get and try to figure out which kind of scenarios lead to similar decisions. And then from that, can we actually identify characteristics of a scenario that drives a certain type of an optimal solution? So when we looked at about 1,000 generated scenarios plus the historical scenarios, what we have seen is that we got about 52 different patterns for optimal warehouse locations. In fact, we got one pattern that got more than 250. That was actually the optimal solution for more than 250 different scenarios. And one of the patterns actually matched the optimal solution we got from our stochastic optimization model based on the historical scenarios. So it was actually somewhat significant to see that a stochastic optimization solution based on the historical scenarios really did not give us the optimal solution when we kind of generated many more potential synthetic scenarios and looked at looked at the optimal solutions that kind of appeared most frequently for each of these scenarios. Furthermore, when we look at that, in the slide before was with the budget constraint. When we took away the budget constraint, we got a similar story. In fact, we ended up getting more than 113 patterns. I mean, obviously, when you get rid of a constraint, your feasible space gets larger. So it was expected that now we actually saw more warehouse patterns getting opened for different scenarios. But still, there were quite a few, at least a few of the optimal solution patterns actually was seen frequently enough for a significant number of the scenarios. So one thing that was interesting, for example, was that none of the scenarios had an optimal solution that matched perfectly the solution that came out of the stochastic optimization model with the historic scenarios. So then, I mean, the natural question is what factor drives optimal decisions across different scenarios? So what we did was the goal of this kind of an analysis is, can we match or predict the optimal decision given some scenario features? So if we know next year or we have an expectation that the next year is going to be in a certain way, then can we kind of start thinking about, well, maybe these features of next year which should drive us to have a certain type of a strategy in terms of where to preposition, right? So what we did is we actually did clustering around the scenarios, around the optimal solutions. And in fact, so if you look at, we were able to get 7 different clusters that, like using several different algorithms. And then it was interesting because in some different clusters, we saw that warehouse locations were exactly the same. However, the commodity inventory levels were different. In some other clusters, when we compared some other clusters to each other, we saw that their warehouse locations were different. However, their inventory positioning levels were similar. So then we also wanted to understand how stable these clusters were in terms of the warehouses that were opened in these, or we wanted to understand, given a cluster, how stable were the warehouse opening decisions within the members of those clusters. And what we could see is actually some clusters had really almost all scenarios that were members of these clusters opened up similar warehouses. So then we also looked at this kind of feature importance study. And to do that, we looked at kind of the features that were kind of obvious part of the characteristics of the scenarios, but also we did some feature generation. And we ended up with about 150 features considered to do our analysis. And we used different methods to identify the right model. And then I would just come to the conclusion where what we ended up seeing is that some of the features seem to be statistically interesting and important for predicting the model outcome, optimal decision outcomes, or cluster membership outcomes. And these actually, so when we looked at these features, some of them were related to what commodities were actually demanded on a sudden onset event. And some of them were kind of some of them were related to the model restrictions. So I will conclude here. But what I would like to say is that this is ongoing work. I think there is quite a bit of interesting results that we can get to now that we have a scenario generation tool that can generate many, many different types of scenarios that is realistic enough. I think we can really analyze we can really solve these for optimal solutions for each of these scenarios. Then we could do quite a bit of interesting analysis around driving insights into what makes an optimal decision, what characteristics of scenarios makes an optimal decision. And we're hoping that this approach will also be a feasible approach that can generate insights for the practitioners. Thank you.
Thanks so much for joining us today, and a very special thank you to Professor Ergun for this webinar topic highlighting how optimization is being used to help transform global food aid operations. So we have a few minutes left for Q&A, and I'm going to turn things over to Ozlem and a member of our technical team, Dr. Dan Steffi, to guide us through the audience questions. Thanks again.